The German POWs expected Los Angeles to be a smoking crater, a testament to shared global destruction. Instead, they arrived at a city so impossibly pristine and abundant that the sight of its unbroken skyline shattered their fear, replacing it with the chilling realization that everything they had been told about the war was a profound lie. The iron hull of the Liberty ship groaned a low, mournful sound, a deep noise that seemed to come from the war itself as it battled the final stretch of the Pacific waves. Wolfgang Hauser, 20 years old, a former student architect, was pressed shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other German prisoners in the stifling cargo hold, the air thick with sweat and stale salt. The final destination felt like a descent into the nightmare his commanders had meticulously crafted and promised. For weeks, he had held onto propaganda. Los Angeles was ash, utterly ruined by retaliatory bombings or devastating naval shelling, a catastrophe constantly emphasized by the Reich's radio broadcasts. Wolfgang expected the air to smell of smoke and chemical waste, a true hellscape ruled by brutal, avaricious Americans. He braced himself for the crack of a rifle butt and the metallic scrape of shackles. He told himself the true terror, the destruction of the soul, would begin the moment they stepped onto American soil. The ship finally slowed, engines replaced by the sharp cry of gulls and the clank of machinery overhead. They were docking at San Pedro harbor. The collective fear was palpable in the hold. When the hatch opened, the prisoners shielded their eyes, expecting industrial floodlights and menacing shadows. Instead, the hatch frame was filled with blinding clean sunlight that warmed their exhausted faces. Wolfgang staggered out onto the deck. The coast did not resemble the leveled devastation of Hamburg or Cologne. There was no widespread ruin, only overwhelming stability. Instead, colossal, functional cranes moved cargo with dizzying efficiency. Buildings, tall, unbroken structures of concrete and steel, stood against an impossibly blue sky. The air carried the faint, strange scent of oil, salt, and something subtly floral from the distant land. He expected the smell of fire. He smelled fresh salt and the faint promise of flowers. Uniformed American soldiers stood waiting, but they were not shouting. They held their rifles at ease. A man in khaki approached the group with a clipboard. He spoke in slow, perfectly clear German, his tone professional, free of threat or malice. "Welcome to California. You will now move to the waiting rail transport." Wolfgang looked back at the harbor. There was nothing menacing, only the overwhelming, unbroken certainty of American industrial capability. This was not the broken nation promised by propaganda. The true war was against the powerful lie he had carried across the ocean. As he was ushered onto a clean train car, the sight of a large, unbroken billboard advertising Coca-Cola made the grim reality of Berlin feel impossibly distant. The realization that his fear was misplaced only amplified a far more unsettling emotion, confusion and deep uncertainty about his own past beliefs. The rattling steel wheels carried Wolfgang eastward, past the coastal mist toward the inland desert. For 3 days, they traveled through sun-baked scrub and sand, and Wolfgang felt a grim sense of familiarity. This, he thought, must be the brutal, empty America the posters warned us about. This was the place where they would finally face the scorching sun and the physical deprivations they were conditioned to expect. Then, just as the sun began its brutal descent, the train crested a low rise, and the desert vanished. Below them lay the impossible geometry of California's agricultural empire. Miles of orderly orchards and vineyards, all precisely irrigated and stitched together by gleaming canals delivering precious water. The sheer scale of the cultivation was baffling. In Germany, every square inch of earth was contested. Here, the land seemed to surrender fruit and life in overwhelming abundance without visible effort. The journey ended not in a fortress, but near a sprawling temporary facility, likely Camp Florence. When Wolfgang stepped down, the air was dry, clean, and carried a faint, sweet smell of dust mixed with citrus. The camp was arranged with unsettling precision, long, simple rows of clean wooden barracks. The camp wasn't designed to crush them. It was built to contain them efficiently and economically for the war's duration. Wolfgang, the architect, couldn't help but notice the quiet competence. The roads were neatly graded. The mess hall was sturdy. Even the barbed wire seemed less about inflicting pain than following strict detached regulation. The sky above was enormous, a deep, clear turquoise that dwarfed the temporary structures below, casting long shadows. The guards who processed them were efficient and calm. They spoke standard, neutral German, outlining the rules of the Geneva Convention with an accuracy that baffled the prisoners. Wolfgang and his comrades were assigned bunks with clean straw mattresses and 2 small blankets each. It was an astonishing level of material comfort for men who had recently spent weeks in cold, cramped transport. The straight lines of the barracks were alien. They were the cold geometry of a machine that never sleeps and never struggles. That first night, the silence of the American plains was broken only by the chirping of insects. Wolfgang pondered the profound discrepancy. He had been prepared to spend the rest of the war fighting the enemy physically, but here the battle was purely psychological, waged against the deep-seated propaganda in his mind. They had expected a pitiless fortress, but found bizarre, unsettling peace. Wolfgang closed his eyes, realizing he was fighting a constant internal struggle to reconcile the propaganda of the fatherland with the bewildering, clear reality of the American West. The enemy had built a prison that felt less like a cage and more like a strange, temporary dormitory. The true psychological warfare began not with guns or shouting, but with a simple meal. That first evening, the German prisoners were marched to the brightly lit mess hall, their stomachs hollowed out by days of mounting fear. They shuffled forward, expecting the thin gray soup and stale bread that had defined nearly every wartime meal back home. What arrived defied every expectation and rumor. The heavy enamel plate was piled high, generous portions of beef stew, its rich aroma filling the room with savory warmth. Thick slices of white bread, still warm, with a pat of glistening yellow butter, mashed potatoes smothered in thick, rich gravy, and canned peaches for dessert. For many, it was the first time in years they had seen such an unrestrained, colorful display of food. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Some prisoners simply stared in disbelief. Wolfgang felt a cold knot of dread. This must be the trick, he thought. They feed us well once before the starvation begins. The Reich's propaganda had been very clear that the Americans were masters of psychological torture. Yet the cook, a burly man, moved calmly, driven by routine, not hostility. This wasn't a show. This was simply how America ate. By the letter of the Geneva Convention, each prisoner was due over 3,200 calories a day, a logistical standard that far surpassed anything available on the rationed streets of Berlin. This immense logistical standard was presented as a hostile gesture of abundance and logistical superiority. The moral weight of the meal was heavier than the food itself. Wolfgang finally picked up his fork and tasted the stew. He ate slowly, watching his comrades. Day after day, the mess hall delivered fresh meat, vegetables, and coffee without fail. It forced Wolfgang to confront a staggering truth. The nation he was taught was impoverished and morally degenerate was, in fact, a realm of unimaginable material surplus. The powerful industrial might of the United States was effortlessly extending its organizational genius to feed its prisoners better than their own government had fed its soldiers. This was the calculus of kindness. America didn't need to torture to prove its superiority. Its power was demonstrated by its ability to generate, distribute, and share abundance, even with its enemies, with quiet confidence. This quiet, confident display of wealth shattered the foundations of Wolfgang's political worldview. The food tasted not just of beef, but of mercy and moral confidence. For the first time since his capture, Wolfgang's mind turned from thoughts of warfare to the unsettling question of logistics. How could a country so deeply hated possess such boundless capacity? And what other fundamental lies had he been told about the world outside of Germany? The true collision between propaganda and reality occurred when Wolfgang's work detail was loaded onto an open-back truck for their first assignment outside the wire. They were driven westward toward the sprawling Los Angeles basin, tasked with clearing brush and infrastructure preparation near Pasadena. As the truck gained elevation, the city unfolded before them, and the breathtaking, impossible sight arrested Wolfgang's breath. He had pictured a panorama of flattened blocks and skeletal ruins, the dark testimony to American vulnerability. Instead, Los Angeles stretched out toward the ocean, an enormous, sun-drenched tapestry of life and color, utterly pristine. There were no scars, no craters, no hastily erected emergency structures anywhere to be seen. Just an endless expanse of terracotta roofs, the silhouette of palm trees and wide, sweeping boulevards built for traffic flow. For Wolfgang, the architect who had seen the great buildings of his own capital reduced to charred mountains of stone, the shock was physical. He searched desperately for any sign of the promised destruction. The city was whole. It was blooming. Houses were brightly painted, their lawns manicured, their structures modern and unyielding. The streets below were filled with clean, colorful automobiles, a staggering parade of personal transport. His internal world began to crumble. He remembered the propaganda assuring them the enemy was suffering equally. Here was the undeniable proof. The enemy's industry was intact. The enemy's life was untouched by the war's devastation and chaos. The work detail was positioned near a large, beautiful civic center. As Wolfgang dug trenches, his eyes were constantly drawn to the structures. He observed the light, airy construction of the residential homes, features unthinkable in a nation preparing for imminent air raids. These buildings were designed for comfort, for permanence, for a life where the idea of a falling bomb was a distant abstraction. Wolfgang realized that the propaganda had not merely exaggerated, it had fabricated the destruction. The lie had been necessary to justify the German sacrifice, but here, the lie dissolved in the clear, golden light of Southern California. It was the most beautiful, most functional city he had ever seen, its vibrancy underscoring the grim reality of a collapsing Berlin. He continued to work, his mind racing. The visual evidence of this intact, thriving metropolis created a cognitive chasm. The foe was not exhausted. The foe was enjoying perfect peace, untouched by the global chaos. The sight of that magnificent, serene city shattered years of conditioning and deeply ingrained fear. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his gaze fixed on a distant, gleaming white tower. He no longer felt like a hardened soldier or a captive. He felt like a fool, someone who had risked everything based on a magnificent, powerful fabrication. The true lie was not in what the enemy said, but in what the fatherland chose to conceal. As Wolfgang worked in the pale dust of the Pasadena foothills, the untouched skyline of Los Angeles became an obsessive focus for his professional eye. He understood the immense collective will required to construct such vertical monuments. The German Reich had prioritized massive, intimidating structures built for dominance and perpetual conflict. But the buildings Wolfgang saw here, soaring skyscrapers, civic halls with graceful facades, spoke a different language entirely. They were built for light, speed, and efficiency. They were the architecture of a free economy at its industrial peak, built for prosperity. He often stared at the clean glass walls, marveling at the minimal ornamentation and clean lines. These structures were designed for an endless future without interruption. The contrast with his memory was agonizing. Berlin's once proud structures now ruined, their ornamentation reduced to dust. America was building in steel and chrome, materials that felt like science fiction compared to the exhausted resources of Europe. Wolfgang noted the intricate web of infrastructure, the precise organization of the highways, the massive wiring, the practically limitless gasoline supply. This industrial capacity was the true core of American power. The same meticulous organization that built bombers was now deployed to feed him. The Americans treated logistics not as a painful necessity, but as an effortless standard of operation. This realization offered a profound, unsettling lesson in geopolitics. The Reich had convinced itself the United States was hollow. Yet here stood the evidence, a society so materially secure it could fight a world war on two fronts while maintaining visible domestic peace and thriving commerce. This nation wasn't just defeating them, it was outbuilding them and out-organizing them on every metric. Wolfgang felt a quiet awe before the unbroken confidence of the place. It was rooted in the effortless functioning of a complex, resilient civilian machine that kept running smoothly. A nation that could afford to build such monuments to light and progress in the middle of a conflict knew it would win. They built for an endless future because they knew they would win. He felt like a student of the future. The buildings of Los Angeles were not just architecture, they were a blueprint for the kind of civilization that survives and thrives. The structures he saw were designed for continuity, and that continuity felt like the greatest power on Earth. The true revelation of America's untouchable confidence arrived one afternoon when the work crew was moved along a broad, clean asphalt artery, Route 66. For the first time, Wolfgang saw civilian life in immediate, vibrant motion outside the camp. The prisoners expected hostility, as propaganda had insisted Americans were filled with bitter hatred. But the truck revealed a world profoundly unconcerned with them, almost oblivious to their presence. Instead of anger, the overriding mood of the road was one of casual, untroubled normalcy. Wolfgang watched the passing parade with disbelief. Women drove automobiles alone, teenagers cycled past laughing, free from rigid military restrictions. Families stopped at roadside diners, indulging in snacks that seemed wildly frivolous given the ongoing global conflict. Every sign for Coca-Cola screamed of a society that was simply living, unburdened by fear or sacrifice. This sight fundamentally broke Wolfgang's remaining resistance. The soldiers who had faced them were tough, but the real power of America resided in the absolute stability of its home front. The German Reich demanded total sacrifice. America fought a world war without ever having to pause its summer holiday or halt civilian life. The most potent moment came when the truck stalled briefly. A young American boy noticed the prisoners from a school bus. Instead of shouting, he gave a hesitant, wide-eyed wave before his mother, driving the car behind, honked lightly. The American soldiers escorting the POWs did not react at all. The shock was the lack of hostility. That simple, non-hostile gesture cut through Wolfgang's conditioning like a knife. It illustrated a nation where children were not taught to hate. Here, there was no pervasive, internalized hatred, because there was no genuine fear of invasion on their own soil. Wolfgang realized the psychological weight of the war was entirely one-sided. The Americans did not need to hate them because their victory was never truly in doubt. Their confidence was so complete that they could afford indifference and, strangely, kindness toward their enemies. He grasped the ultimate lesson. The greatest strength was not found in the rigidity of tyranny, but in the effortless resilience and abundance of an open society. His nation had sacrificed everything. This nation had sacrificed almost nothing at all to maintain this vibrant domestic peace. The war that had stolen Wolfgang's youth had also annihilated German culture, replacing it with rigid martial parades. In the American camp, prisoners were given access to American leisure, something far more corrosive to their worldview than hard labor. Periodically, a guard would bring a newspaper which detailed the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team, Hollywood films, and glamorous movie stars. A nation supposedly struggling for survival was openly indulging in massive-scale, frivolous entertainment and celebrity culture. The profound disconnect between the solemnity of the war and the cheerfulness of American popular culture created an immediate dissonance. In Germany, all art had to serve the state. Here, art serves only entertainment and profit. Nothing was more baffling than baseball. Sergeant Frank, an American, tried to explain the game, the leisurely pace, the unnecessary rules, the idea that grown men were paid vast sums simply to play. Wolfgang could find no military purpose. It was pure, unadulterated play and distraction. Sergeant Frank spoke of the World Series as national importance. Wolfgang's mind struggled to reconcile this enthusiasm for a simple game with the reality that American planes were concurrently damaging cities across Europe. How could a nation possess such capacity for destruction and yet maintain such a gentle capacity for joy? The entertainment was not a reward. It was a byproduct of an immense, stable machine that created everything from battleships to leisure. The music, swing and jazz, spoke of passion and individual expression. The Hollywood films celebrated personal freedom and individual success. This cultural revelation became a quiet form of psychological victory. The Americans simply exposed them to the fruits of their system. The subtle message was devastating. The Reich offered sacrifice. America offered abundance and joy. The carefree culture, floating on a sea of untouched material wealth, left Wolfgang pondering a terrifying possibility: that the true purpose of a great power was not to dominate, but simply to allow its people to live well and laugh, often in peace. The ultimate lesson in American confidence came from the California heartland. Wolfgang and a small detail were moved to a vast citrus orchard, picking the overwhelming harvest for a local family-run farm. The orchard was tended by the Garcia family. Mr. Garcia treated the prisoners simply as a sudden, unexpected source of labor, not as objects of hate. He spoke little German, but communication relied on the shared language of work and necessity and mutual respect. The propaganda painted the Americans as ruthless. Here, authority was built on fairness. Mr. Garcia assigned tasks and then left the men to their work, observing without menace. The trees were heavy with oranges and lemons, symbolizing a surplus that defied European wartime comprehension. One afternoon, Mr. Garcia noticed Wolfgang struggling to repair a crate. He quietly took the hammer and showed Wolfgang a simpler, more efficient method, leading by competence, not rank. This display of practical knowledge built immediate trust. The most jarring experience came during break. Mrs. Garcia, the farmer's wife, brought iced water and fresh orange slices. She approached Wolfgang and, through hesitant gestures, asked him about his life before the war. She wanted to know if he had a family and what the buildings looked like in Berlin. She saw a young man far from home, not wearing a uniform. Wolfgang spoke haltingly of his dreams of architecture. Mrs. Garcia nodded and handed him a perfect, newly picked orange. The orange, a piece of abundant sweet fruit given freely, was a moment of profound moral clarity. This individual act of kindness proved the enemy was not a monolithic machine of evil, but people capable of simple decency. As Wolfgang peeled the orange, he realized this was the truest form of American victory: the ability to treat a uniformed captive not as a monster, but as a person deserving of common courtesy and respect. The warmth of the orange and Mrs. Garcia's quiet question served as a painful, beautiful reminder. The structures of war, built on lies and fear, could be dismantled by the simple, enduring architecture of individual human kindness. The final definitive moment of the conflict arrived, not with a roar, but with the quiet hum of a radio in the camp office. May of 1945 brought a sudden, inexplicable stillness to the air. Wolfgang and the other prisoners felt it immediately. The American guards moved with a subdued efficiency and heavy expressions. The official confirmation came one afternoon. Germany had surrendered. An American lieutenant read the short statement without a triumphant speech, his voice sober. For a moment, the world stopped. Wolfgang braced for the expected celebration or gloating. But there was nothing. The soldiers stood quietly, their faces neutral. It was a victory without triumph, a profound demonstration of silent confidence. The lack of American celebration was the final, powerful testament to their discipline and confidence. The German prisoners were split between disbelief and deep anxiety for the homeland. Home was now synonymous with rubble and chaos. He looked around the immaculate camp and at the intact landscape of his captivity. His country had fought itself to destruction, while the enemy's life remained untouched and prosperous. In the days that followed, the atmosphere was defined by efficient processing. The American administration, following protocol, began preparing the men for repatriation. This logistics of going home, paperwork, and medical checks was handled with the same unwavering competency that had fed them throughout their confinement. Wolfgang's greatest realization came during this waiting period. He was leaving a nation that had shown him the true face of strength, a power so absolute that it did not need to humiliate its foe. The Americans' moral confidence had proven to be their most formidable weapon of all. As he packed his few items, Wolfgang looked out at the distant, sparkling lights of Los Angeles at night. The city stood intact, a glittering monument to the victory that had been achieved far from its streets. He was no longer a soldier filled with hate, but a witness to an unsettling truth about human nature. The journey home would take him back to a ruined continent, but he would carry an undeniable image of what a peaceful, abundant future could look like, imprinted forever by the unbroken cityscape of his former captors. The journey back to Germany was long, slow, and bitterly cold, traversing a continent exhausted by war. When Wolfgang Hauser finally stepped off the troop train in Berlin, the clear, bright image of Los Angeles was immediately replaced by the harsh, monochromatic reality of rubble and hunger. The city he had loved was reduced to a vast, grim landscape of broken stone and displaced neighbors. Wolfgang, however, carried a quiet, powerful vision that others lacked. While his fellow returnees focused on shelter, Wolfgang, the architect, saw not just destruction, but immense potential for rebuilding. He remembered the clean, efficient layouts of the American camps and the light-filled buildings of California. He had seen proof that civilization could be built quickly, cleanly, and with confidence. He immediately found work with the Allied Reconstruction authorities. His English was functional and his knowledge was critically needed. But his designs were different. While others proposed heavy, fortress-like buildings, Wolfgang designed for light, openness, and utility. He insisted on wider windows and materials that allowed the meager sunlight to flood the interiors. He built, in a sense, not for the past, but for the brighter future he had glimpsed. He would often sketch plans, recalling the efficient organization of the citrus orchard. He explained that the new Germany must not be built on fear, but on the principles of lightness and efficiency he had observed in California, which represented true stability. As Berlin began to rise, Wolfgang married and raised a family. He rarely spoke of the war, but often spoke of the real America, the abundance, the joy of baseball, the kindness of the farmer's wife. He showed his children faded sketches of the intact Los Angeles skyline. In his professional life, Wolfgang became a quiet human bridge. He used the American logic of logistics to organize labor, ensuring every project was executed with the meticulous speed he had witnessed in the supply chains of his captors. By the 1960s, the buildings Wolfgang designed stood proudly across West Berlin, modern, functional, and optimistic. Wolfgang's new buildings were described as light and open, the architectural legacy of his time in California. They were quiet monuments to a moral victory won by simple example. Years later, a reporter asked Wolfgang why his work was so focused on light and openness. Wolfgang smiled tiredly and pointed to the clear sky. He explained that he had learned the ultimate truth of civilization in a prisoner camp. The lie of the bombed city was the last thing to fall, he said softly. The Americans won because their architects never had to think about bombs, only about light. That confidence, that belief in an unending good future, is the blueprint for peace. Wolfgang never returned to the United States, but he spent the rest of his long life building the future he had first seen in the glittering, unbroken heart of Los Angeles. If this story of impossible kindness and shocking historical contrast opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We uncover profound human stories hidden beneath the surface of history every week.